One question I get asked all the time is, what frame rate do you shoot your stop motion at? Which frame rate should I use? Or how do I get my stop motion animation to look smooth? The obvious answer is that the higher the frame rate, the smoother the animation, the better the result. But it's not that simple. In fact, I'd argue that, as opposed to aiming for the highest frame rate and equating higher FPS to better animation, we should instead ask ourselves this: what is the lowest possible frame rate I can animate at? Not only are we after a smooth animation, we're also after efficiency, and wasting hours working on every short scene is not only discouraging, but impractical when the movements can look good even with less frames and we want to cover more material in less time. In this video, we'll be testing two different types of scenes, each at three vastly different frame rates, and together we'll see which frame rate we should aim to shoot at, and how that might vary depending on the scene. The first scene we'll animate will be a punching sequence. This falls under the category of action animation. I'll be using the Storm Arena Ryu action figure, which I recently got and I'm very excited to put to the test. An action scene typically has very fast movements, which means that our poses change very often when compared to a regular acting scene. Is it worth it to dedicate more time for higher frame rates on an action scene, or can we get away with less? Let's first go through the process of animating an action scene at only 8 frames per second. At 8 frames per second, the spacing between my poses need to be quite significant in order for the moves to look fast enough. You can see that within one frame, the pose can change drastically compared to the previous frame. Less minute posing and larger spacing allows us to get through our animation very quickly, and this one only took about 15 minutes to complete. Unfortunately, the finished animation leaves much to be desired. At 8 FPS, we're definitely getting a choppy effect, and it feels as though we're missing a few in-between frames to really be able to read each movement clearly. At 12 frames per second, we get some more breathing room between each action. The spacing starts making more sense here, and we're able to put more in-between poses to fully define the arc of each movement. The process takes quite a bit longer, clocking in at about 29 minutes of animation time. Thankfully, the end result is much better this time. The illusion of movement is kicking in, and it no longer feels as though we're watching a really fast PowerPoint, but an actual moving character. There is still a little bit of choppiness. Let's see what happens when we up our frame rate even further. At the full 24 frames per second, the process requires twice the amount of frames. Not only does it take longer since we're taking twice as many pictures, it becomes slightly more difficult to move our figure's joints in smaller and smaller ranges. Aside from that struggle, the process didn't take me as long as I thought it would, clocking in at just over 40 minutes of animation time. This really surprised me, as the 12 FPS test took twice as long as the 8 FPS one, but this one only took an extra 33% longer. The end result of the 24 frames per second test is very fluid and easily the best looking version. Having those extra frames allowed us to achieve fast movements without having large gaps and missing in between poses. When comparing the 3 action scenes we did, it seems that 24 frames per second is the clear winner. For scenes that involve such quick actions and larger spacing, a higher frame rate vastly improves the end result. It allows us to insert those frames between big movements and fully define the arcs of motion. For action shots, higher frame rate does seem to equal better animation, though it will obviously take much longer to animate. But does this apply to every type of scene? Let's do the same test, but this time with a slow movement, and see how the frame rate affects the animation process and the end result. This scene consists of Ryu doing a slow movement, transitioning from his martial arts stance to a sort of horse stance with arms at his side. At 8 frames per second, the movement here is simple to animate. This being a slower move, we're able to have smaller spacing than the action scene. There's no issue with the arc of motion being hard to read, and this arm movement is clear even at this low frame rate due to it being a slower one. It only took 9 minutes to animate this one, and I even ended up cutting 3 to 4 frames, which means it could have been done in even less time. The end result is actually not that bad. It's still got the choppy feel that may be unavoidable at this frame rate, but at least the movement is clear. At 12 frames per second, this slow movement was a breeze to animate. The head turn can be smoother as we're able to add some additional in-betweens to smoothen that movement. This scene took less than 14 minutes to animate at 12 FPS. A slower and simpler scene like this feels quite natural to do at this frame rate, and the process presented no issues. The end result is a very smooth and readable movement. The head turn looks much smoother than the 8 FPS one, and the slightly higher frame rate allowed me to add a subtle movement to the entire upper body when the arms are tucked in. At 24 frames per second, this slow movement required some very precise adjustments between each pose. I'll be honest, my execution here wasn't as good as it could have been, and I seem to have rushed the process a little bit. Clocking in at just over 16 minutes of animation time, only 2 minutes more than the 12 FPS version. However, though it didn't take much longer to animate, I found myself more frustrated while doing this one. It was difficult to perform the minute adjustments required to achieve the slowness of this movement. I felt the limitations of the action figure with some joints getting a slight ratchet motion when trying to nudge things just a touch. As we can see in the end result, having to shoot so many frames and having to struggle with moving stiff joints resulted in the entire figure slightly shaking throughout the shot. Though the arm movement is quite smooth, the shaking happening at 24 frames per second looks worse than the end product of our 12 frame per second version. The shaking may simply be due to my poor animation skills, but it's still a valid thing to consider when shooting a slower scene. I'm sure a better animator than me would avoid any shaking on a slow scene, but in the limitations of my abilities and the time I have, I find that the experiment still holds value. In the end, I personally find that the 12 FPS version looks best here. For such a slow movement, we didn't need all those extra frames to define the motion, and the spacing was close enough that it doesn't look choppy either. That, plus the time and effort saved from having half the amount of frames, is well worth cutting our FPS in half from 24. As we look at the results of our frame rate testing, we can see that for an action scene with fast movements, a higher frame rate will give us more room to include in-between poses and define movements more clearly. This is vital to action scenes, as the faster something is moving, the clearer of movement needs to be in order to be able to understand it. And when it came to our slower paced scene, our optimal frame rate lands somewhere in the middle. In my opinion, if we're after something that genuinely looks smooth, 8 frames per second might simply be too little, though it definitely saves a lot of time. 12 frames per second is a sweet spot for this type of scene in practice. We could definitely achieve a smoother result with significantly more effort at 24 frames per second, but the fewer amount of frames doesn't harm the end result when the movement is small. After all that testing, we can conclude that a higher frame rate benefits faster movements, and a slower frame rate helps save time when it comes to the actual process. I think some further testing can be done between the range of 12 to 24 FPS for action scenes, as I found a nice medium at 15 or 16 FPS in the past, but for slow scenes I think I will definitely stay in the range of 8 to 12 frames per second. This will save me time and effort, and the result may even end up better than if I went for 24. I hope this was informative and useful to those who are interested in stop motion, or even animation as a whole. If you have any other animation topics you'd like to see covered, let me know in the comments, and if you'd like to see more, please like and subscribe for more tutorials, reviews, and animations. Thanks for watching.